Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
A battle is being waged in educational systems across the country about books that deal with LGBTQ issues. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Many youth are now faced with a battle raging over the appropriateness of material for classrooms and school libraries. But for Dr. Loren A. Olson, coming out as a gay man did not occur until the age of 43. He has now published a new book about the struggles of his life entitled No More Neckties, a memoir and essays. So what might he have to say to those young people? Well, we have him on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, well, let me ask you a question, because there are a lot of youth that are struggling with their identities. What would you have to say to them, particularly in this time in which you see this battle occurring over books and whether or not these issues should be mentioned at all in the classroom?
Well, I'm very concerned about that. I think everybody believes that parents should have the absolute right to tell their children about sexuality, but in fact, most parents avoid that topic altogether. And so what happens is that if children don't get good information from someone, they're going to turn to the internet and often get into porn sites and things like that, where they get information which is distorted and doesn't really tell us what mature, safe sex is about.
Because I think in your book, you write that these topics we're not supposed to talk about, but not sharing them cuts us off from others and leads us to feel isolated and disconnected. And I could imagine that if you're young, a teenager, or if you're in high school, that would be a disconnect.
Yes, and in fact, what happens is that all children have some curiosity about their bodies, and it begins at a very young age. My grandsons are in a real good sexual education program in Seattle called Sexual Health and Family Health and Sexual Health, I think it is. And it's a very well thought out plan that teaches about protection of themselves against sexual violence and assault, but then goes into really just the very specific kinds of information about sexuality, and talks somewhat about LGBT issues, but in a very responsible way, and gives them some good information about that.
So what do you make of this battle that seems to be brewing over books, I guess particularly in high school libraries, in which I guess they are considered young adults, and the fact that some of these books are being pulled out?
Well, I get very angry about it. In fact, I have a bumper sticker that says that I read banned books that I put on my car because, so many of these information have very casual mentions about sexuality. They're not really explicit sexual books. They're just talking about relationships in terms of people having crushes, people having wanting to have a relationship with someone of this, of the same sex. It's not about what really happens but in a sexual way, and so it's not really about sex per se, but more about romance and caring and about attraction and helping people to feel normal. And when people don't experience some sense that other people feel that same way, they feel very isolated, very alone, don't know who they can talk to. And for adolescents, of course, with their high level of emotionality, they sometimes begin to contemplate suicide as a way of getting out of it. And I think many of the teenage deaths are related from suicide are related to conflicts about sexuality that they feel they have no one to go to about them. And of course, now it's not just books being banned, but teachers being banned from talking about it in any healthy way. And that, I think, is just a terribly dangerous situation, because many of these people can't go home and talk about it. I had one experience where a young adolescent told his grandmother that he was gay, and she said it was okay, and he went home and told his father, and he went home and shot himself after telling his father, because his father said I won't have a gay son. Well, if you are gay, you know that you can't change that. And if the father's saying, I won't have a gay son, what is the recourse for you? The only other alternative is kind of to divorce your parents and move away from that, which puts kids on the streets and homeless, seeking for a connection with other people. And that's terribly risky as well.
Now, in your book, you talk about this concept of a masculine image. Tell me a little bit about that and how you struggled with that yourself.
Well, the issue is that my father died when I was 3, and so there were many times as a young man when I thought I had this sense of difference, that I wasn't exactly like the other boys. I wasn't particularly good at sports. I wanted to be and needed to be in the community that I lived in because everybody focused a lot on sports. I wasn't comfortable around fixing machines or doing things with my hands, and I was easily brought to tears at times, and I think I interpreted all that as a result of my father's being gone and not being able to teach me how to be a man. And so there were many times when I searched for examples of men that I could model my life after, but really becoming a man became more obvious to me, or more realistic to me, when I came out as gay and realized that some of these things that I had struggled with were not based on my father's death, but just because I was gay, and I began to feel much more normal as I began to talk to other men who had grown up also with the same sense of difference.
Now, what was life then like then in the small town that you grew up in? Because there are a lot of people who grow up in cities. I grew up, for instance, in Los Angeles as an example, where there's a tremendous diversity of people. But in small towns, that's not the case. How did you deal with that as you began to question your own sexuality?
Well, I grew up in a town where everybody looked alike and thought alike and believed the same things, and there was no exposure. Of course, I grew up in the 1950s and 60s, and so though there was no one at all in my life that was living an openly gay life, I didn't know anyone who was openly gay until I was 32 years old. And so when you don't have the experience of connecting with people who are leading a healthy gay life, all you have to deal with are the stereotypes inside of your head. And in most cases, the stereotypes are not things that you want to be. So it creates this great sense of shame and guilt that that life that gay people live is so much different than the life that you want to live and expect to live. And the only way that you can get rid of that is to begin to expose yourself to a larger gay community. And I didn't have that available to me after I went to University of Nebraska and medical school, and then into the Navy. There were all those years when, and of course at that time, homosexuality was considered pathologic deviancy. And so all of the things that were pointing me toward being gay were risky and dangerous. And I got married, had a couple of kids, and then it began to be more aware of same-sex attraction, then it meant the potential of giving up my family, and that became a big threat of a loss to me as we were going through that time. And so I think, even in cities, though, there are communities within the city where being gay just is still not accepted. We think it's a lot easier now to come out as gay, but so much of it depends on the culture and the society and the religion that you're a part of that controls whether or not that's going to be safe and easy for you to do.
Because I was going to ask you, because there's this sort of dividing line, it seems to me. Obviously, the big event was Stonewall 69, in which there was this sort of shift that took place within the gay community, becoming much more visible. We obviously had Harvey Milk, for instance, in the 1970s, but as we push forward, we see a great many, for instance, gay and lesbian characters on television, even right to this day, and even in commercials. How do you contrast those two eras that you seem to have lived through?
Well, yeah, it's remarkably different, that to be able to see that, and a lot of the things in TV and movies, though, for a long time didn't portray same-sex relationship as healthy relationships, and oftentimes they came to a tragic ending rather than to have a healthy life. Now, there's fortunately much more in the way of exposure to people living comfortably in same-sex relationships, which is a good thing. But none of that was available when I was young. In fact, even in my 40s, I remember trying to watch a movie with my wife about same-sex relationship and feeling very nervous about it, wondering what she would think as we watched the movie together. And so there were not a lot of books about it. Just really was not much at all. And most of the, more scientific medical literature about it talked about the coming out process is starting when you were a teenager and expecting to see that you would be out and understand your sexuality by the time you're 26. Well, for a lot of people, that's just not true. A lot of people are still questioning their sexuality as they get much older, and so a lot of my connection has been with older married men who are struggling with the same-sex attractions that they didn't understand for a long time, and are struggling with being in heterosexual marriages and conflicted about that.
I want to turn to family because it seems to me that's the other component to all of this. You write that your mother, for instance, accepted you being gay, but she worried about that she wouldn't see you in heaven. And there are a lot of families who may very well accept a gay son or a gay daughter, as it may be, but they don't have any tools to deal with how to approach them, how to accept them, even though they feel they should accept them. They may be conflicted, indeed, as your mother was. What about that component, that family component?
Well, I think the thing about it, Don, is that we have to realize that when we come out to our families, that we have probably struggled with this question about it for some time. And when we finally make the statement, I am gay, to our parent or other loved ones, it's a new thing for them. And so they're going to have to go through the struggle of what this all means and figure that out. And so there's a difference in the terms of the timeline for them and for the person who's coming out. And hopefully that over time they will begin to, but when you come out, you kind of celebrate that you're finally out and you're able to say it out loud, and you want everybody to be excited about it, but oftentimes people you love aren't, and they have to deal with grieving the loss of the dreams that they had for how your life was going to unfold. And hopefully that at some point they will begin to shed some of their own stereotypes about what it meant for you to be gay, and begin to see and accept the reality. The issue of religion is tough. My mother was counseled by her minister that she would not see me in heaven, and she read a lot of books about trying to figure it out. But that was, and I can't argue with her belief in that is something that she believes strongly. She came to love my husband and accept us and everything, but I think even to her dying day that she felt some uncertainty about whether or not we would meet again. And I struggle with that issue and feeling that she had so much pain around that issue. but that wasn't something I could fix for her. She had to resolve that herself. I think, there are more resources now available to parents, things like PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Gay and Lesbians, and that were not available to her. But the religious issues are very tough for most people to deal with, and there are more affirming churches now available to people, but it is a problem.
Well, in terms of churches, I guess it was attended a Lutheran church at one point. How did you resolve this? And I think in the book you basically said that you left the church, as it were. And I don't know whether you've joined another one or not, but what's your sense about faith?
I did stop going to church. I tried to make another attempt to go back to the Lutheran church, and it was a fairly large congregation. And after I had been there, I wrote to the minister. I said, what kind of outreach do you have to the gay and lesbian community? And he wrote back about 10 words, said, none. We're a family church. And he had no interest at all in sort of trying to engage me in any way. And after that, it left a real bitter taste in my mouth. But I'd grown up as a Lutheran. My whole family was Lutheran. It was an important part of our heritage. And I just couldn't see myself being anything else. And then I had a painful experience with a man when I was at the gym. And I went to talk to a friend, and he said, well, not every church is like that. And he sent me to a church called Plymouth Church in Des Moines, which is a United Church of Christ. And I went there and found that they had a large percentage of their population were gay and lesbian, and those who weren't were very supportive of us who were. And so I became pretty active in that congregation. My husband and I were actually married in that church. I'm less active than I was for a while, but it was a source of great comfort for me at the time. One of the mottos that they had at the time was, we don't do dogma. And the idea that I could be there and not be told what I must believe, that I could come to terms with my own beliefs, was very helpful to me. And I know that there are other churches who have struggled with this. Even the Lutheran Church has made some changes in that direction, and in recent years, and have become more open about it. But it's still an issue in a lot of churches that's still preaching very strongly against homosexuality, that it's a choice, that it's a sin, and you can be gay, but you can't just act gay. You have to suffer in silence about it. That's the only acceptable alternative.
One of the themes that seems to be running through a lot of discussion, particularly about the books, is that the sexual experience itself. And one of the folks who support keeping these books in the libraries is that it opens up a way for particularly young people to understand sexual experiences, as you indicated a moment ago, perhaps protect themselves, but because it's for everybody, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual or gay, for that matter, that you're going through a process of trying to figure out who you are. Talk a little bit about trying to understand those experiences, and particularly trying to be forewarned about what might be abuse as opposed to might be genuine affection.
Well, I think abuse can occur at any age, and it often results as an imbalance in the power dynamics in the relationship, primarily. And I think that it's important to understand that some kids are much more vulnerable to that experience than others. I've had people who've been adolescent boys who've had experiences with it as adult men who see it as a positive thing, and others who have been terribly damaged by it. The age of consent is sort of an abstract concept, and even though the law has to establish an arbitrary age of consent, our levels of maturity differ from person to person, and when you can make adult decisions about your sexuality varies. But what we find is that a large percentage of kids who are 13 or 14, whether they're heterosexual or gay or whatever, are having sexual experiences as early as 13, 14. And by the time they're 19 years old, it's something like 85% are having sexual activities. Well, there's a lot of learning that's going on during those years about how to behave sexually. And it is a tough time in adolescence, I think, to figure it out, and a lot of people struggle with it. Those of us who are gay often delayed any sexual activity or dating because we just didn't know what to do or didn't understand it, and became very isolated and alone in dealing with our sex.
So, what lessons do you think you've learned that you could impart to young people who are grappling with their own sexuality?
Well, I think one of the things that I would say to young people is to try and find a trusted adult, or at least an older person who has some ability to accept what you have to say about your confusion, and also to begin to ask important questions about that, and to understand that our sexual identity isn't a point of time. It evolves over a period of time, and nobody really understands why we are attracted to the people that we're attracted to. That's an unknown, and that whatever kind of attraction they have is just part of being human. But they have to look for people where it's safe to talk about, and it's not safe to talk to everybody about, for sure.
One of the issues that have come up are trans people, and that sort of seems now to have followed on to the acceptance of, say, same-sex marriage, gays in the military, and so on. It seems to have now taken to the fore as sort of the next step of looking at this issue. What kind of progress do you think is being made in terms of that, and how does one deal with the idea of being trans, and what kind of experiences do they have? What is it that you can say about that in terms of we're now sort of in this new stage of sort of looking at that dimension of sexuality?
Well, I think the politics of division have, for some reason, focused on the issue of trans people now, and the number of trans young people that are murdered is a really significant problem right now. It's a dangerous time, and so many things that are being said about them are really more politically motivated than anything else. It's politics of division and creating a fear of trans people. For example, one of the biggest issues now is about whether or not a trans woman can compete with other women in sports activities, and suddenly it gets distorted to the point where teams of trans women are going to dominate college sports. Those kinds of things they're so extreme and so exaggerated, but it's all an invitation for people to get really stirred up and become fearful. It's very difficult to combat that, and for trans people right now, it can be very dangerous to come out. and it's a really difficult time. And of course now, for example, in Texas, some of the laws are beginning to change that parents are even considered to be abusive to their children if they take them to see a provider who can initiate treatment prior to the age of consent. And the provider themselves can be considered doing malpractice under those circumstances. And, those laws are being copied and pasted into other states as well. But it has so little to do with the realities of what it means to be trans, and a total lack of understanding of the difficulty and pain that these people experience. It's all really politically motivated. And it's tragic to see that some of these resources are going to be closing down and not available to trans kids. I mean, why would anyone choose to change sexes to be a competitive athlete? It doesn't make sense, to go through that kind of permanent change in your body as a way of getting a trophy. It's just so unrealistic to think that people are going to do that. And I think that they oversimplify what it means. It's like suddenly we can change to have an advantage over other people. It's so unrealistic.
Are you optimistic about the future in terms of society grappling with this changing set of mores and changing recognition of the community?
That's a tough one, Don, because right now with all of the laws that are being considered on the topics that you're asking about, I'm not optimistic. I mean, it feels a lot like I lived through the McCarthy era when communism and homosexuality were so much a part of politics, and then again when living through the HIV epidemic and seeing how we were told that we deserved to die. I think that same wind is blowing now, and I find it fearful. Now, having said that, the wind changed for a while, and things and it probably will again. But I don't think we're at the bottom of this situation right now. I think a lot of it depends on how the vote goes, and that's a concern.
We've been speaking with Dr. Loren A. Olson. He has published a new book about the struggles of his life entitled No More Neckties, a memoir and essays. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Don.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.